because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. As they were walking along the road, a man said to him, "I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He said to another man, "Follow me." But he replied, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Still another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." Jesus replied, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the service in the kingdom of heaven." This is the gospel of Christ. You may or may not know, but in the Anglican tradition, Anglican church should I say, they have evening and morning prayer as part of their tradition. As you know, I work for an Anglican mission organization. And so morning and evening prayer have also become part of something that I do. Not as devoutly as my Anglican brothers and sisters, but has become a part of my tradition as well. And they have a set of prayers and Bible reading that is contained in their prayer book. And each morning, each evening, they will follow this set of prayers. In fact, clergy do what they call their offices. And this is part of their offices. And if you go to old rectories, old manses, you will actually find little chapels where clergy will withdraw in the morning and in the evening and do their evening and morning prayers. That's a long introduction. You can use that today over lunch and to start a conversation. But I tell you this because on Wednesday I was in Durban in the port, and I was at morning prayer with the staff and the chaplain. Part of this tradition is that they will focus on a specific saint. Now, while some of these saints, obviously the historical foundation is a bit sketchy, some of them are based on tradition, what the idea of focusing on a saint in your morning or evening prayer is that they speak of people who played a significant role in the history of the church, but more importantly, who set examples about what it meant to follow Christ. And on Wednesday we heard the story of Alban, the first martyr in Britain. Somewhere in the 3rd or 4th century, that's just about when Basil was born, Christians began to suffer cruel persecution. And Alban met this priest who was running away from this persecution. And he sheltered him in his house for a number of days. And as Alban watched the priest conducting evening and morning prayers, it had an impact on his life. And he became a Christian because of the example of that priest. And eventually, the authorities heard about this priest that was hiding in Alban's house. And so the king gave orders for soldiers to go and search his house, Alban's house, and find this priest. And when the soldiers came to the house, Alban took the priest's clothing and his cloak and put them on. And so the soldiers arrested him, thinking that he was the priest. And he was tortured and later beheaded. So Alban's choice to follow Christ meant that he was put in a place where he had to count the cost. And that cost was to offer his life for somebody else. Thank the Lord that we don't suffer like that for our faith in this country. And there are horror stories of Christians today that will be suffering in places like North Korea and Islamic-dominated countries. They still will be put to death. They still will suffer persecution because they have decided to follow Christ. As I prepared the sermon this morning, and this is the text that is presented in the lectionary, there was a struggle because it's something that we don't often want to talk about. I don't want people to ask me, what is your faith costing you? What price are you paying to follow Christ? What price are you paying to call yourself a Christian? Are you suffering for the gospel? I don't want them to ask me those questions. And often we emphasize this free gift of salvation, this free gift of grace. I mean, if you're going to talk to somebody about becoming a Christian, you're probably not going to start off, brother, it's a wonderful life. You're going to suffer. And it's going to cost you a whole lot of stuff. Won't you join us? That's probably not how you're going to start the conversation. It isn't something that we emphasize when we talk about Christianity. But this passage this morning, especially our gospel passage, forces us to stop and consider that other side of our faith. Yes, salvation is free, grace is free. Christ calls us to live a life of joy, a life to the full. But the other side of that story is that in fact there is a cost. There is a cost to being a disciple. Our gospel passage begins with Jesus on this journey to Jerusalem. And the writer tells us as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely, that word resolutely means with purpose, with determination. You can almost see Christ stopping and saying, I know what I'm called to do. I know what the Father is asking me to do. I need to make a decision. And that decision is to follow my Father, to follow my calling. And he sets out in determination towards Jerusalem because he knows what's going to happen there. He's not dragged, kicking and screaming, but he makes a choice and he heads to Jerusalem. Jesus had counted the cost. He had made the decision to save mankind. And part of that cost meant that he had to go to Jerusalem. Now, why does he go past the Samaritan village? Scholars suggest that it wasn't just that he got lost, GPS wasn't working, but in fact that he made a conscious decision. As he had made a conscious decision to go to Jerusalem, so he made a conscious decision to go through this Samaritan village. As we know, Samaritans were like Blue Bull supporters. Samaritans and Jews did not get on. They were not friends. Samaritans felt that Mount Gerizim was the place that you should worship God, and Jews felt that the true place of worship was in Jerusalem, and they did not interact with one another. So why is Jesus going to a village that he knows is hostile? That he knows that he's going to be rejected in? Why does he make that difficult decision? I think he does it because what he wants to say is this gift of salvation is not just for Jews. It's for everybody. It's for everybody. This trip to Jerusalem is about saving the whole of mankind. Now, of course, the disciples haven't quite grasped that. They think that Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem to take over the city, to become king. Their solution to the problem is not a spiritual one, but a political one. Their solution is about power. It's about getting rid of the problem. Getting rid of this problem. Let's call down fire from heaven, Jesus. Let's destroy these people that are opposing us. Let's get them out of the way. And Jesus' answer is no. I've not come to destroy. I've come to give my life. I've come to save. I think there's a message in that for us this morning. Because often we think that as Christians, we just blast our problems away. That's what it means to follow Jesus. We have this power that we can just call down fire from heaven, and all our struggles will just disappear. But as we know, there are not always instant solutions to the problems that we are facing, the difficulties that we are facing. Yesterday, for those of us who were at the men's breakfast, Kevin used a wonderful analogy of cycling, saying that we're probably in life on a hill. And it's the gradient of that hill, those of you who cycle or run will know, it's the gradient of the hill that kind of varies. And that's part of our call. And part of our call is to struggle up that hill. Just keep on moving forward. And so that's what Jesus is saying. That being a disciple, being on this journey, is about perseverance. Being on a journey to do what God has called us to do is about perseverance. It's about pushing through. And he goes on in the next section to actually elaborate what this cost is, what this idea of pushing through is, about staying committed. First man says, I want to follow you, Christ. And again, it's interesting. Jesus doesn't say, yes, come along, my friend. It's all going to be great. And, you say, yeah, you can follow me. But remember, it's going to cost you something. There's going to be a sacrifice here. Your life is going to be uncomfortable. That's how I interpret that passage. Your life is going to be uncomfortable. And so perhaps the cost in following Jesus is going to be, well, I can't actually take that better job. I can't get to that place where I'm going to get more money, because actually God is calling me to this community and this context, and I need to stay here. Perhaps that cost is, actually, I mustn't go to that extra business meeting, or I mustn't do the extra exercise thing that I planned for this week. I can write in my program, actually 50 Ks rather than 80 Ks. Because you know what? I need to spend time with my family. It's going to cost me something. Perhaps it is saying no to that unethical deal, because that's what Christians do. And it will mean losing out. Maybe losing out on a deal. It's going to cost me something. But that's the right thing to do, because I'm a Christian. The second man says that he wants to respond to following God, but he has some legitimate family business to deal with. Now, I don't think Jesus was saying we need to sacrifice our family and our relationship for the gospel. As a minister, unfortunately, I've had people sit in my study, marriages that have just imploded. And often it's about the one of the spouses going, well, but I'm serving the church, so I spend all my time in the church. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. What I think he is saying is that sometimes we're going to need to make sacrifices that are out of the ordinary for the sake of the gospel. One writer put it like this. He said, sometimes the call to follow Jesus is about breaking free from the expectations of our culture. Sometimes a call to follow Jesus is about breaking free from the expectations of our culture. You see, this man wasn't simply just going to miss his father's funeral. We need to understand this in the context of that culture. It wasn't just about missing your father's funeral. Because part of his responsibility would not only be to bury his parents, but also to look after the household and the family from that point onwards. Sons didn't run off and take missionary trips to the Far East, but they stayed and looked after their family. And so that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying that this is going to cost you something that when the rest of society look at you, they're going to go, that's not right. Why are you not fitting in with what's the norm? Why are you not fitting in with what everybody else is doing? So this isn't a call not to love our family. It's a call that reminds us that sometimes we're going to be asked to do radical things for Christ. And these things will not necessarily make sense to those around us. And this message is, I want to believe, not only a challenge for those of us who are facing those choices, but perhaps also a reminder and an encouragement for those of you who are sitting here that have already made those choices. That you sit here now and you say, you know what, I've decided to follow Christ. I've decided to do something that God has called me to do. And those around me are going, that doesn't really make sense. Why are you doing that? Finally, Jesus reminds us that those who are called by Him need to remain focused on the task at hand. See, being a follower of Jesus requires commitment. Now, I've never plowed a field. Did some research on it. Apparently, if you are plowing with a horse or an ox, you need to keep your eyes in front of you on the ox and on the place in which you want to go. That's how you plow in a straight line. You can't look back and see what you've done, because then the ox wanders off and you get kind of this kind of pattern. So it requires this commitment, looking in a straight line. In the Old Testament reading that Billy read, Elijah calls Elisha into the ministry. And he does that by putting his cloak on him, a sign that he's passing his mantle, passing his ministry onto him. And Elisha runs after him and says, hold on. I'll do this, but not quite yet. I've got some other stuff to do. Some domestic stuff. I must sort out my family. I must sort out my spiritual life. It's fascinating as a minister how many people you meet and they haven't been to church for a while. And you go, oh, how are you? They immediately start to confess. It's a fascinating thing. And they'll always go, I've got some stuff to sort out. As soon as I've sorted it out, then I'll be back. Brothers and sisters, if I had to sort out my stuff before I came to church, you would never see me. Because this is the place we sort out our stuff. This is the place. And so Elijah replies, what have I done to you? The way that I understand that is that, well, you don't have to take this position. You don't have to respond to this call. I'm offering you it. I'm saying to you, I see you as the person who is going to succeed me in this ministry. But if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. But what I am saying to you, there's some urgency in this appointment. You need to respond now. And Elisha understands that. His actions say that he realizes the urgency. He realizes that he needs to respond to that call. And so he destroys his old life, so to speak. He takes the farming equipment, he makes a fire, he burns the oxen, or cooks the oxen, shares it with the farming hands, and begins his life. He accepts his life as a prophet. He accepts this new purpose, and he does not look back, but moves forward. Now, man, I struggle with this. I want to keep on looking back. The good old days, eh? The good old days. Man, I want to look back. It was so much better then. So much better then. I don't want things to change. I want them to be like they used to be, because it was much better then. Part of the radicalness, shall we say, I think, of following Christ is that we need to be moving forward. Things are changing. We cannot go back. We cannot recreate. We cannot have life like it was. We need to be forward. And I understand for some people that's more difficult to do. But I want to suggest that God is asking us to move with Him. He wants us to create something new in our community, in our country, in our families. Part of the struggle that we have, I would say, in our land at present, is that kind of we just keep on going, well, and that's all sides of the argument. It's there. What is before us? What is before us? That's what God is calling us to do. And that's radical. It will require some radical thinking, some new ways of thinking. But I think that's part of the cost of following Christ. There's a freedom that Paul invites us to in Galatians. A freedom I want to suggest when we kind of just let that stuff go, eh? And just move forward with Christ. But what is that freedom about? It's not for ourselves, but it's to serve Christ and to serve others. And it's going to cost us something. It's going to cost us something. And perhaps just not always this radical cost that we think following Jesus is about. It's not always about giving up everything, about leaving home to some far distant country. But it's about looking at our everyday lives, looking at our context, and listening to that small voice, the Holy Spirit, and responding to that when He asks us gently to get out of our comfort zones, to maybe think a little bit more, to maybe give a little bit more, to maybe respond a little bit more. So Jesus stands before us this morning, calling us to follow Him. And He reminds us that choice is going to cost us something. Maybe not right now, but certainly I want to suggest as we journey with Him. May Christ give us the strength to respond this week to that small voice that will ask us perhaps just to give a little bit more, to love a little bit more in the places that we find ourselves. Amen. Let's just be quiet for a moment.